I'm here to talk to you today about rights of nature, nature guardianship, and perhaps most importantly, how you can bring both of those things into your own life and back out into the world. The reason I undid my dungarees was to reveal this t-shirt here, which is my favourite t-shirt. And to say that we are all, of course, aware of the multiple and sometimes overwhelming crises that we and the Earth face. The soils crisis, the ocean crisis, the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, the chemicals crisis, all of them. And I'm going to be making the point today that all of those crises ultimately stem from the same root, which was a direction that humanity went in about 200-300 years ago of effectively regarding nature and the earth as dead and as a resource to be exploited for human ends with almost no limits. And that, I believe, is at the root of all of these crises that we face ultimately, that the crises that we face won't be solved unless we ultimately address that underlying issue. And that more importantly, even if we solve one crisis, such as the climate crisis, we're still really doomed unless we deal with the underlying issue. And if we're not careful, in solving one crisis, like the climate crisis, without solving the underlying issue, we might make everything worse. For instance, if we try and keep the same energy intensivity of our current society using non-carbon methods, that's going to lead to great destruction all around the world to try and make an industrial civilization that is zero carbon, that might actually end up making things even worse. So I want to talk to you about rights of nature. What is rights of nature, first of all? Does anyone, who's heard of it before? So I can take a temperature check. Rights of nature. Some, but not that many. Okay, I'll do a small intro about it then. So basically, rights of nature is a kind of package of different ideas about how the human legal system, political system, economic system can relate differently to the earth and to nature. Because at the moment, nature is property. Nature has no right to have its voice heard in court or to actually properly be heard in our economic and political and legal systems. So for instance, if someone damages one of you, hits you, poisons you, does something bad to you, you have the right to take that person to court and to sue them for that. And your rights are protected as a legal, we call it legal personhood, the right to be heard in our legal system. Nature doesn't have that. So although we have some environmental protections, ultimately, if a tree is damaged, the tree cannot sue someone for its protection. If a river is poisoned, the river can't go before the courts and say, I want the law properly applied to me. Now, as I'm saying that, some of you are probably thinking, well, that's a bit nuts, because how can a tree sue someone? It doesn't really make much sense. Because, of course, we can see how humans can sue someone, but it's more difficult to imagine how nature might do it. So I want to tell you also about the fact that legal personhood is not the same as human personhood, because we've already extended legal personhood out way beyond humans. For instance, charities. If you steal a charity's property, the charity can sue you in its own name. Even more interestingly, and perhaps the most fascinating example, is companies. We've now got so used to them in our society that we barely even think how bloody weird they are as a concept, how strange it is. We've just made up a concept and made it more powerful than any human being or natural element that actually exists. So if you go into Tesco and damage their products or set light to their store or knock down one of their walls, Tesco will sue you. Tesco, which isn't an actual thing, it's a concept that we've made up, will take you to court and sue you to stop people doing that. Right now, there are armies of hundreds of thousands of lawyers just in the UK acting all the time for companies' interests to stop you doing things to Tesco that you're not allowed to do. And yet, there's not a single lawyer acting directly on behalf of a river, of a tree, of birds, of wildlife. And it's in many ways a testament to the ingenuity of lawyers. There's a few in the room that I can see. That we gave legal rights and personhoods to fictional entities, companies, something we just made up, before we gave them to the natural world, to trees and rivers, which not only actually exist, unlike companies, but for which we rely on fundamentally for our own existence. And that's what Rights of Nature seeks to address. And there's different ways you can do that. And it's instead of seeing it as one sort of magic thing, it's a whole ecosystem of different interventions, effectively, to bring that about. So sometimes it can be trying to get nature protected on the international level, for instance, through getting the crime of ecocide, which many of you may have heard of, which would basically mean that mass destruction to nature would be on a par with crimes like genocide, which protect humans. You couldn't do the same thing to nature. But the crime of ecocide wouldn't be enough because, in the same way as the crime of genocide doesn't protect you on a day-to-day basis, neither would ecocide protect nature on a day-to-day basis either. So there's different interventions, and they've been going, if you plot the rights of nature interventions around the world over the last 20 years, it's kind of a hockey stick graph. They're really increasing in number. There are some countries which have put the rights of nature into their constitutions so that laws can't be passed that conflict with the rights of nature. Some of those have been unsuccessful. Bolivia, they put rights of Pachamama in the constitution. It's basically had very little effect on the ground. Some have been more successful. Ecuador did it, and that actually stopped drilling in a part of the rainforest last year, oil drilling. The most interesting example that I know of, and sorry if anyone's heard me talk before, because I always go on about it, is the Wanganui River in New Zealand. Which, as part of the peace settlement between the British Crown and the Maori people, basically got given self-ownership, a guardianship body, and some legal rights by an act of the New Zealand Parliament. And that's very interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, because the New Zealand political and legal system is very similar to ours. In fact, it's probably one of the most similar in the world due to that sort of common law colonial connection. So we know that it would be very possible to have such an intervention in the UK as well. We could have an Act of Parliament that grants self-ownership, a guardianship body to the River Thames or the River Wye, or what's the local river around here? River Brue, there you go. I'm glad someone knows that. I've already given it away slightly in what I said a minute ago, but can anyone think of the difference, the key difference between the UK and New Zealand in this respect? Indigenous people. Yeah. Most, not all, but most rights of nature interventions around the world have been in countries with a strong indigenous voice, with people who never actually accepted the Western worldview of nature as dead, as a resource to be exploited, who always understood that nature is alive and we are intimately connected with it, and who are trying to find ways to express that in the current legal order. Actually, it's a kind of critique of rights of nature from some indigenous peoples that actually talking about the rights of nature doesn't make any sense because it's sort of like a trump competition, and actually that doesn't make any sense at all. But for me, it's probably one of the best ways we have to put that indigenous worldview as nature is alive, as nature's voice needing to be included in our decisions and our systems into the current legal order that we have. So that being the case, and the importance of the political context and the indigenous voice for rights of nature, what do we do in the UK? Where we've been severed from the land for so long, where the mere word indigenous is actually mostly used as a racist far-right term, and where our political context can't even stop water companies filling our rivers with shit, let alone actually giving those rivers rights. And this is something I've been thinking about for a while. Do we just kind of give up, throw our hands up in despair, move to a commune in the countryside and put up the barriers and make our area nice and let the rest of the country go to crap and let our nature be destroyed. I thought about all of those. And to me, the New Zealand Wanganui River example teaches us something else. Although the Wanganui River was given self-ownership and a guardianship body by law, the actual laws affecting the river weren't changed. So people could still extract water from the river, could still use it to water crops, could still travel on the river, that kind of thing. And so actually, I realized there's nothing to stop us just doing the same right here, right now, and deciding that we are going to act as guardians for nature in the current legal context and allow its voice to be heard through us and through our actions, to be true guardians for nature. And luckily, and I didn't know this at the time I was doing it, 6 years ago, I'd lived on a boat for 5 years. I've lived 11 years in total. And 6 years ago, after 5 years of just moving around the rivers every 2 weeks to a new mooring spot, I decided that I was tired of being chased around by tedious pen pushers based in an office in Milton Keynes, which is the Canal and River Trust, who force you to move on every 2 weeks and send a guy knocking for you with a notice if you don't move far enough. Yeah, it was fine for a few years, but after a while I got resentful. And decided I wanted to set down roots, but I also didn't want to pay £10,000 to £15,000 for a mooring, which is what you pay in London. So I decided to try and find another river. And at the time, I had no intention that the relationship I was entering into was one of guardianship. It was mostly a desire to put down roots somewhere, have a mooring, and not pay through the nose for it in London. But I literally got a map out of all the rivers in London to find out where they were and whether any of them were still accessible. And spoiler, they're mostly not. The famous rivers of English myth and legend in London, the Fleet and the Tyburn, are all gone, basically reduced to sewage drains underground. And even the other rivers are embanked and weird and everything else. There's one called the Wandle, which was an option, but it had a weir too close to the front. There's the Darrant, which is too far out. It's not even in London. Don't want to live in Dartford particularly. And there was one which struck out to me. And I had no idea when I was looking at the map that what impact it would have on my life and the relationship that I would go on to build with that river. But the river is the Roding, R-O-D-I-N-G. And it's the third biggest river in London after the Lee and the Thames. It flows through outer London, which is good and bad. It's bad because it means it's full of rubbish, no one cares about it, and it's got a massive motorway right next to it. But it's good because the property developers hadn't got to it yet. And there was no, unlike on the Thames, which is run like a sort of medieval fiefdom by the Port of London Authority, who are bastards and don't care. And unlike the River Lee, which is run by the Canal and River Trust, and again, pen pusher moving you on, it had no one in charge of it. It was just being left to its own devices. No one cared for it, but it was still big enough to get a boat up. And so 6 years ago, I moved there to put down roots and start a project to restore the river. Becoming the first person ever to live on the river, and without any real plan as to what the hell I was going to do. I spent the first few months being terrorized by local children from the estate. I mean, to be honest, if I were them, I'd probably terrorize me too. That's unfair to me. And yeah, I then put out a call out for other people to join and to begin a project to restore the river. And at the time, I hadn't realized the extent to which that project on the Roding would become a laboratory for how to practically make this idea of rights of nature and guardianship a thing, take it out of the legal academic textbooks, take it out of the kind of dry, boring areas of the law and making it a reality. But actually over time, the project has really become almost more important than the legal rights of nature jurisprudence, this practical idea of without anybody's permission and without me being appointed by anybody at all, just going along and saying, I want to be the guardian of this river and I will do whatever it takes to protect her, is a very powerful idea. And the reason I particularly want to talk to all of you about it as well is there's a worry sometimes when lawyers speak that we're this sort of almost priestly caste who are going to come along and make everything else okay, ride in on our big legal steeds and say some magic words in front of a judge and stop the heartbreaking destruction that is going on all around us and continues. But as a barrister, I can tell you we don't have that power a lot of the time. We can try our best, and we do have some power, and there are some people trying their best. But you mustn't put all of your hopes and dreams into us as legal interventions. It is within every single one of your powers to become a nature guardian, to adopt a specific part of nature, whether it be, we can discuss trees and rivers and that kind of thing, and to act within the current system to protect it. You won't always win. There will be destruction and there will be losses. But it is within the power of every single one of you to do that. And there are other nature guardians. I found them in other rivers. There's one on the River Brent, which is the kind of the Roding's in East London, and the River Brent is in what?
West London's where I live.
Ah, yeah, there you go. Yeah, I found him on Twitter. There's a guy on the River Brent who's basically done this. He hasn't actually moved on the boat, but he just kind of adopted it and just harangues people on Twitter. Like, and it's kind of like a sister river, because like the Roding is in the east and the Brent is in the west, and they're basically quite similar in their length, size, environmental problems, everything else. And he's doing his like thing with Clean Up River Brent. And I really admire that. And throughout the country, there are just ordinary people who have no legal training, not politicians, who've just decided that they want to act for nature and be its guardian. And they are making a huge difference, probably far more difference than some of the kind of top level NGOs trying to change things, but actually failing. And if I was to have a choice of whether I would have a Rights of Rivers Act 2025 passed by Parliament, which is then roundly ignored by everyone, as our current legal protections for nature are, or to have a group of 10 to 20 people on every river in the country acting as its guardians and doing whatever they can to protect it, I would choose the latter. And the beautiful thing is that the latter, we're not waiting on some grand political change. It's within all of our powers right now to do that. I don't know how many people there are in this room, maybe 70, 80? If even half of you found out your local river and went to become its guardian and protector, that would be another, 30 rivers around the country with a champion, with people speaking out for them and ensuring that they're protected. It could make a massive difference. So that's just like academic side. I'm going to give you a few stories or examples of what guardianship can look like on a practical level. So I started out tree planting, and they mostly died. Because we slip planted. I don't know about slip planting, where you literally put a spade in, you stick the little sapling in, and then just close it down. And it's basically on top of a flood defence. It was too dry. And so I learned over time you have to like properly dig out the hole and put in compost and like properly mulch it and everything else. And actually this year's saplings are looking a lot healthier. But more than that, I learned that there are different types of trees. And again, that sounds obvious, doesn't it? And I'm doing a tree identification walk in a minute, so I hope it's not revealing how amateur I am in my tree. Well, actually, it's not amateur, it's self-taught, right? Like, I've never gone on a course, I've never done an ecology course, never learned anything. I've just learned from experience of what trees, which trees are which and what trees like what. And that is a beautiful thing of nature guardianship and that's why we're going to do the tree identification walk, is that learning about what trees are what enables you to understand what conditions they prefer. And I read somewhere that you can just take a branch of a willow tree, just cut it off and stick it in the ground and it regrows. I know some of you know that already, but I think it's just worth like just pausing on that fact for a moment and just realizing what an absolute bizarre miracle that is. You know, it's like a kind of resurrecting tree. It's like, it's genuinely magic, isn't it? And so I started doing that, and just randomly for my birthday 3 years ago, instead of having we had a massive party as well, actually, to be fair. But before the massive party, I got all my friends out on a cold January day to just literally plant sticks in the ground, in the mud by the roading. Ones like this, pretty much. And see what happens. And I snuck back a couple of months later, just as spring came, and the tiny little buds were just coming out. And I was like, wow, it's a miracle. That wasn't the end of the miracle, though, because I've gone back over, they're right by me, so I go past them every day. And I have to keep going and checking Facebook to check when my birthday was, when they were planted, because it was only 3 years ago, but the tallest, as tall as that beam there. And for the first time ever, I was showing a Guardian journalist around the river, and I was pointing them out, being like, they're almost big enough to climb now. I've never climbed one of my trees I've planted before. And he was like, go on then. So I was able to climb the tree. That's how big it was. From this to a climbable tree with a trunk like that and that high. I think we planted about 70 of them that day, just sticking sticks in the ground. And that's completely open to you at any point for free to do. Willow grows profusely. If you want to know where to harvest everyone and give you some trees on the roading, you literally just get a pruning knife. You can imagine what it's like, a little pruning knife, and take off the side branches, stick it in wet mud or wet ground, and it will grow. It doesn't cost you a penny, and you can do tens in an afternoon. And without anyone's permission, again, just to reiterate that point, I've never asked anyone's permission for any of these trees I've planted. I'm fundamentally changing how Barking Town Centre looks without any permission from anyone. And the trickster in me, I absolutely love it, because it's like, these trees are some of the biggest growing trees in the UK, and because they're wet trees, they grow the fastest. So, oaks, to be honest, won't reach full size in my lifetime, but in like 10, the council don't know what's going to happen, because at the moment they're just stop growing above, but in a couple of years' time, they're going to go like, woof, like the whole of Barking Town Centre is going to be like, where do these trees come from? And we're also on the tree walk, potentially, if we find some good spots, gonna plant some of these around here. Again, I don't know about the permission point. Maybe I probably should ask the owner. I feel like it's against the thing of the talk. The key thing I would say is don't ask for permission, but always do have a little research about the environmental matters, because sometimes you can plant trees in the wrong place, which isn't good. And for instance, on the roading, we don't plant them in the middle of the reed beds, because reed beds are by themselves good. We edge it. So there's going to be reed bed, wet trees, dry trees, scrub, like a mosaic of habitats all the way through. The other really interesting guardianship idea, which I love and really illustrates this idea of humans, the human beaver is what I'm starting to call it. And I think there's two wrong ideas about the perception of human beings in the world at the moment. One is the idea of this kind of techno-utopian humans as God, that we can just build more solar panels, completely expropriate nature, and will, through our intelligence, solve all the problems despite being brutally disconnected from nature. That's bollocks. But another thing that I think is bollocks, which our community is much more prey to, I've noticed, is the idea of humans as a virus, which I really dislike. We are not a virus. There's a system, capitalism, regarding nature as a resource that's quite viral in the way it acts, but we are not a virus. We are meant to be ecosystem engineers. We are meant to use our unique talents, our intelligence, our ability to move from place to place, to change our environment for the enrichment of all life. And for me, and a perfect example of that is the black poplar, which is the UK's rarest native tree. It stopped being able to reproduce a few hundred years ago, naturally. We don't quite know why, probably because we fucked all its habitats up. But it reproduces really well from cuttings. So for me, that's a perfect example of how we can be guardians, is taking cuttings from existing trees and just planting them around, because it can't do it itself, but we can do it really easily for it. And so actually I bought some black poplars from a nursery, and then I met a guy on one of our volunteer days who said, actually, the ones they sell in the nurseries is it's a rare species, but there's common types of it, cultivars. So if you imagine human beings as a species lost the ability to reproduce and we could only clone ourselves, we'd be left with just the genetics of the existing humans to clone from. And over time, the number of different genetic types would get lower and lower and lower as different clones weren't taken on. It's like that with black poplar. So there's one called the Manchester poplar, which is the most common. It's like 70-80% of the genes of black poplars is that one tree. But there are some rare ones which are the only type in the world of that gene. It's one tree. And a crazy, in a good way, man in the 80s went and researched them all and produced a map. He had them all genetically tested to work out which ones are which cultivars. And you can find a list online. And now I just go along to them with my pruning knife and just go up to take a few branches that aren't going to harm the tree and take them back to the roading in a backpack on the train, like sticking out of this like giant backpack of trees, and then planted them. So now Barking has probably the best collection of black poplars in London. And in a few years' time, we'll probably have one of the best in the UK, and all basically for free. Because I've just literally I took another probably 70, 80 cuttings this winter from all the rarest trees and planted them all along the roading, and they love it. Literally just put the stick in the ground and it's just like, yes, nutrients, water, light, I'm happy. And I brought this one along. We can plant it here somewhere today. It's got really beautiful buds. Unfortunately, it got snapped in the taxi on the way here because I tried to put it in the boot and it didn't quite go. So we have to, yeah. But it'll still grow because it's very hardy. I realise I'm slightly running over time, but I wanted to give another 1 or 2 examples of guardianship. So we all know about the sewage problems in rivers, right? It's all in the news. Water companies basically, instead of spending money on treating sewage, prefer to give it to their shareholders and then put the sewage in the river because no one will stop them doing that, in short. Follow Fergal Sharkey on Twitter for more. He's an 80s pop star turned river guardian guy. Legend. And basically that's a really interesting issue because on the roading we've had a number of sewage spills which are completely illegal, like really serious criminal offences that if they were prosecuted would get fines of hundreds of thousands of pounds. But nobody was even knowing they were happening. So literally on a volunteer day, I was like, we were out along a bit of the river I hadn't been to before, and I was like, what's that smell? And literally like walked through some brambles and just came across an outfall, literally with like spewing out actual turds into the river that have been happening for probably months and would probably still be happening now. But I called it in to Thames Water, said that this is a problem, and then started creating a stink, not meant to be a pun, creating a fuss locally to stop it happening. And then it happened again a few months later, and I was like, no, this is not going to happen. And now Thames Water are actually doing the work to fix that outfall. But the key point is, even though that was illegal under our current laws, because no one was acting in the river's interests, no one even knew it was happening. A lot of the time, we just need people just to walk our rivers. So I walk my stretch of the roading at least once every week or two, just to work out what's going on. Someone's put some fly tipping in, someone's putting sewage in, all this kind of thing. And even just doing that to your river, getting really aware of it, is important. And again, like about a month ago, I was walking along the river with a poet who wanted to write about dying rivers. And I showed him this like outfall. I was like, yeah, I've been suspicious of this outfall for a while because it kind of smells weird, but I've never seen anything coming out of it. And I heard a rumbling from inside the pipe and I was like, what's that? And I was like, shit. I literally jumped out of the way and it like pumped, like spewed like a huge amount of like sewage right out. And it was pumped basically. So it's like got a tank and then it pumps it out in one go into the river. And I got a video of it, shared it on Twitter, and it got shared by Fergal Sharkey, the pop star, and got 500,000 views around the world, and people were angrily treating Thames Water. Next day I went down there and they shut off the entire street and had a pumping operation in place to remove that sewage into a sewage works that had been going into the river for at least a few months, I think. Right. And the point about that is available for anyone to do. Anyone could just do that. You don't need any legal background. It was just an illegal sewage spill. They just needed someone to know and care about the river. The final one I want to give is a kind of, and there's lots, by the way, if you want to ask me about more other examples of river restoration guardianship, I'm happy to chat all evening to you with other examples. The final one I want to give, which I think is a really cute one, is I was walking along the river and saw these like crazy birds in the center of Barking. They looked a bit like swallows, but they were like kind of looping around. And I noticed them like flying into the river wall, like as if they were just hitting into it. So I went and checked it out from a different angle. And they were actually like flying into holes in the river wall. And I found out with a bit of research, they were sand martins, which naturally nest in sandy cliffs. They travel all the way over from sub-Saharan Africa in the spring, nest in sandy cliffs. And because there's no sandy cliffs in London, there's only about 10 colonies in London. These sand martins had just taken some old drainage holes in the wall and nested in them instead. Like, this place they've chosen is one of the grimmest places in London. It's like next to a Wickes car park, opposite a BP garage, a giant Tesco Extra and a main road, no trees, just like this kind of grim place. And these like sand martins just like loving it. And to me, it felt really special to see them. Like, it brings my heart indescribable joy. I wait for them all through March and early April to when they're going to arrive. Also worried because, of course, they might never come back. They might have got hunted on the way or something happened to them elsewhere. So I sort of wait with this sense of anticipation and trepidation all of spring. And then when I see my first one, it's just so joyful to see them fly and come back to their nesting area. And thank you. About a year and a half ago, I got contacted by our landlord, who's the Queen. The Queen didn't actually contact me. Definitely not now. We'll scratch that one from the recording. Moving on. So the Queen, actually, the Crown Estate owns the river, and the guy who does that area, the Crown Estate, contacted me saying a developer wants to redo the river wall there. Right, and had nobody before me even knew that colony existed. It just wasn't known. No one had even looked at it. So had that not been known, the developer would just come in, redone the river wall. If they were nesting at the time, just killed them. If they weren't nesting at the time, destroyed their nest so they could never nest there because they can't nest in a sheer concrete wall. And so when the Crown Estate came to me, I said, yes, you can have permission to do this on this bit of the river, but in order to do it, you need to do it outside of nesting season and make sure that all the nesting holes are reinstated and ideally new ones provided. And they agreed. And then this winter, I was also down there. I put like a ladder down and some waders and went in, just like cleaned all the nesting holes for them. I know, it's so cute. Just imagine how like cozy they'd be in the little nesting holes in the wall in this horrible place in Barking. That's the story of the Barking sand mine. So there's a few examples there, and there's like literally a dozen others of things where I'm like, the swans look like they can't nest. Maybe I should build them a nesting raft. Or, there's a kingfisher, and again, they need holes in the river wall, so I'll build them a little kingfisher nest box. And just speaking for and fighting for nature on a really hyper-local level within the current legal framework. And that's available to all of you right here, right now, with no law changes. And just to finish off, I guess, is how or why you get to that. And for me, there's quite a simple formula that has happened to me. I should emphasize, and I've said this to a few people over lunch, but I grew up in a working class family where it was like footy and telly. That was the things you did. No one ever told me to love nature. We didn't spend any time in nature. I managed to get myself into a good university and become a barrister. But I literally want to go and do corporate law and make money. So none of this comes from outside of me. And the journey of transformation into that guardianship, which I'm still on, and I've still got a long way to walk until I become a truly eccentric old man living on my river and being its guardian, which I'm kind of looking forward to as a process. I think it will suit me. It's quite a simple formula that you can all follow. The first is knowledge. Really getting to know a specific piece of nature. It's quite hard to imagine it in the abstract, but find your local river, your local woodland, your local trees, your wildlife, somewhere that you can spend time with and see regularly, and just spend time there, notice it. I guess it's easier for me because I live on a boat, and so I literally live on the river. I see her in all different seasons. I've seen her over 6 years now. I know when people are harming her. I know if it's rained in Essex or London by the colour of the water. If it's rained in London, the water's kind of dark from the road runoff. If it's Essex, it's like milky and chocolatey from the field runoff, both of which are problems, of course. But in different ways, like deep knowledge. And I found that even without trying, without any effort on my part, that knowledge just gave way to love. Because I truly believe that we will love that which we know and protect that which we love. And it really goes in that order, I found. And it's an equation in the sense that in my experience of it, it's required no forcing. It's required no forcing at all. Just being on the river, I got to know her. And now I really love her. And the next part is even more obvious. If you love something, of course you're going to protect it. And that fierce love itself is a really valuable resource that I've found. For instance, in dealing with Thames Water, if you go up to them and go, well, the Water Framework Directive says that you're not allowed to put sewage in according to blah, 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 it doesn't really land. Whereas I've said to Thames Water, I love this river. I said that to, they're a bit like, oh, he's a bit weird. I love this river, and be under no illusion that if you hurt her, I will do whatever I can to lawfully and peacefully damage your business. And I do. You know, when they put sewage in, I go online and I create a fuss about it and like really go for them in any way that I can, because they are damaging the river that I love. And we see this nature gardens all around making the difference. You've probably seen in the news, there's been lots of tree felling recently in different places. What has made the difference is ordinary people who stood up and say, no, I love this part of nature and you are not going to take it. And if you are, you're going to come through me. And like in Sheffield, in the big Sheffield tree dispute, people stood under trees for 2 years, day in, day out, in all weathers, not letting them take their tree. And willing to go, but some of them were nearly put in prison for it and nearly lost all their assets. And they were like, no, you're not taking this because I love it and I will protect it. And that is how I believe that we can make rights of nature happen in this country. And it's why I urge all of you to think about this idea of becoming a guardian of nature and a specific piece of nature that really speaks to you and which you can get to know and thereby get to love and therefore have an unconquerable will to protect. Thank you.